Hey, what's up, gentlemen and ladies? Happy Independence Day to Gabon, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about the face of Square Enix, a guy who made one of their most popular franchises and who still makes games to this day, even if he is slightly obsessed with this one specific mobile title. That's right, I'm talking about Tetsuya Nomura. Just kidding, get that trash off my screen, it's Hironobu Sakaguchi.
The story of Hironobu Sakaguchi is the story of the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. That being said, we're gonna skip his entire life from his birth in Ibaraki in 1962 all the way to his college years at the Yokohama National University during the early 80s. Sakaguchi was actually studying electrical engineering, and his interest in programming led him to be interested in the brand new 1977 Apple II computer. However, he was a broke college student who couldn't afford it, so he instead chose to go with a cheaper knockoff that he found in Akihabara, which he still couldn't afford. I mean, hey, times were tough, man. This, combined with the fact that he dropped out of university in 1982, meant that things weren't looking so hot for Sakaguchi, and he began looking for any part-time job that he could find. Enter Masafumi Miyamoto, the son of the owner of the Denyusha Electric Company, who had just recently started a new branch within his father's company simply titled Square. At the time, Sakaguchi was actually more interested in music than anything else, playing in various bands and booking local concerts while still in school, but he figured that the programming he could learn from this Square company thing might come in handy someday. He worked as a designer on several games that the company produced for the NES, including The Death Trap, King's Knight, and Rad Racer, to name a few. However, most of them were pretty trash, I'm not even gonna lie, and they didn't really sell all that well either. So in 1986, when Square split off from Denyusha and became independent, Sakaguchi began to wonder if he should just quit and go back to school. But despite this, he decided to give video games one more chance. One final chance. For a while, Sakaguchi had been wanting to make a role-playing game in the style of Ultima or Wizardry, but the company didn't think that this would sell. However, that all changed when a competing Japanese company made a fantasy RPG for the NES in the style of Ultima or Wizardry, and it sold. This was Enix's Dragon Quest, released in 1986, and with the success of that, Square decided to let Sakaguchi attempt to create a fantasy RPG, and development began that same year with a whopping team of 7 people. He originally pitched the name Fighting Fantasy, however, this was already taken by a series of British role-playing game books, so the name had to be changed. Since this was Sakaguchi's last attempt at a video game before giving up on his career at Square, he chose the name Final Fantasy. So Sakaguchi had a small team of designers and programmers, but he decided to take on the role of writer himself as he came up with the story for the game. His friend Nobuo Uematsu, who had just started to work for the company 1 year prior and had composed the music for several of Sakaguchi's games, agreed to compose Final Fantasy as well, but they were still in need of an artist. The search, no joke, actually kind of went a little like this.
Alright guys, we got story, gameplay, music. But we still need someone to do art. Does anybody have any suggestions?
Well, actually, I kind of had a suggestion.
Ishi, is that you? Mom, man. What's up?
Well, there's this guy named Yoshitaka Amano who does artwork here in Tokyo, and I really like his stuff. We could get him.
Yoshitaka who? I've never heard of that guy. I'm sorry, but we are not getting...
You don't understand. He's actually like a pretty well-known artist. Like he's done art for like anime and stuff like that.
We are not getting that guy.
Then what do you suggest?
Right here. Something like this.
Gucci-senpai, my man, I hope you realize that artwork that you're pointing to right there was made by Yoshitaka Amano.
Yeah, maybe we should give that guy a call.
And with that, Final Fantasy was born. It released in Japan on the Famicom in 1987, and by some miracle, it was a huge success, selling close to 5 million total copies, including in regions outside of Japan. But with this success came the expectation of a follow-up, and Sakaguchi, to put it frankly, wasn't a huge fan of sequels, which yes, is very ironic considering that Final Fantasy is one of the longest running video game franchises with well over 90 titles and probably the most amount of numbered entries of any video game series. I mean, I can't really think of any others that have gone higher than 15, although I'm sure if there is, someone will say it in the comments. But anyways, this prompted Sakaguchi to, instead of making a full-on sequel to Final Fantasy in the same world with the same characters, he instead made a game in a similar style to Final Fantasy, reusing using many assets and with much of the same staff, but at the same time trying to reinvent the wheel. It would have a new story, new setting, and relatively new battle system, and thus we got Final Fantasy II. And after that, Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy IV, and Final Fantasy V. However, in 1991, Sakaguchi was promoted to Executive Vice President of the company, and when development of Final Fantasy VI began in 1992, he wasn't really able to work on it as much as he had on all the previous games, this time around only taking the role of writing the original story. Even so, Final Fantasy VI was seen by many, including Sakaguchi at the time, as Square's magnum opus, and even though Sakaguchi's involvement with the franchise would only decrease from here, the biggest thing had yet to come. Final Fantasy VII, seen by many as one of, if not the greatest RPG of all time, and what introduced most Western gamers at the time to the entire role-playing genre, actually had a bit of a rough start in development. Much like with Final Fantasy VI, Sakaguchi decided to have a more laid-back approach to this game, only working as a producer and writing the story, leaving major roles to some new faces like now famous director Yoshinori Kitase and first-time main character designer Tetsuya Nomura, names synonymous with the Final Fantasy franchise nowadays. However, during the development of Final Fantasy VII, Sakaguchi suffered the tragic loss of his mother, which really affected him. However, instead of stopping his work, he actually decided to incorporate themes of that into the game with one of the game's main characters, Aerith. As most of you know, Aerith is tragically killed during the events of Final Fantasy VII, and while the characters do grieve over her loss, they exist in a world where everyone who dies returns to a stream that they all come from, and even if they're dead, they're not really gone, themes that Sakaguchi really wanted to incorporate into the game after what he went through. And the release of Final Fantasy VII marked Square's most popular and best-selling game of all time. Final Fantasy's legacy is one that is rivaled by only a handful of games, and it's likely that it'll always hold the golden throne for Square. However, this game also marked the last time that Sakaguchi was really truly involved heavily with a Final Fantasy game, and many consider it the end of an era. Just 2 years later, Final Fantasy VIII came out, which failed to live up to the giant expectations left after Final Fantasy VII. Sakaguchi would only be credited as an executive producer in this title, getting noticeably more distant with the series. This all culminated, however, with Final Fantasy IX, which was meant to be a throwback Final Fantasy to the older Super Nintendo titles. A more classical fantasy setting was chosen instead of the steampunk one seen in more recent titles, and Sakaguchi actually came back to write the scenario for this one. They even had a more old school style instead of the more modern, iconic Tetsuya Nomura character designs that had gone on to be the face of the series for quite a few years at that point. To this day, Sakaguchi still claims that Final Fantasy IX is his favorite in the franchise, and many fans seem to agree. However, Final Fantasy was never really the same after this game, and many changes were about to come to the franchise and the company as a whole. Development of Final Fantasy X began on the PlayStation 2, but Sakaguchi was personally more interested in making a film than working on the games. Enter Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. This film is infamous among Final Fantasy fans, or just gamers in general, as being one of the worst video game movies in a huge pile of bad video game movies. The main issue with The Spirits Within is that it seemingly just had the Final Fantasy name slapped onto it because it was recognizable. Now, Square was no stranger to doing this in the past. If you guys recall, there were some games in the Saga series released in Japan on the Game Boy, but that they didn't think would sell in the West, so they instead called them Final Fantasy Legend to try and boost their sales. The same happened with the Game Boy game in the Mana series, which was renamed to Final Fantasy Adventure when localized. However, these were small and relatively insignificant spin-offs that most people didn't even pay attention to. The Spirits Within, on the other hand, was a feature-length film that cost close to $140 million to make, 94 million of which it actually lost and caused the entire Square's Pictures division that had just been created to shut down. Now, at the same time, Final Fantasy X had just released to generally pretty great sales and reviews, but this wasn't enough for Sakaguchi, and soon after, he stepped down from the entire company and left after his huge loss. This also reduced Square's financial capital, and in 2003, they merged with their biggest competitor, Enix, creators of Dragon Quest, to form the company we now know as Square Enix. To say that Square Enix was misguided and in desperate need of new talent after Sakaguchi left is quite an understatement. Final Fantasy XI was successful enough, but it was an MMO, not really in the same style of game as the older FFs. Then Final Fantasy X-2 was created, a first for the series, making a direct sequel to an existing game, something that Sakaguchi was heavily against, as he believed that games should be complete experiences. Final Fantasy XII, although it didn't sell as much as some of the other entries, definitely did have its fans. However, most people can agree that it didn't really feel like a Final Fantasy, as it was mostly handled by a team that up until that point had only created the Tactics spin-off series. And then they just went absolutely crazy with all the spin-offs for Final Fantasy VII, making a PS2 shooter, a PSP prequel, a flip phone game, and even a goddamn movie that was somehow rated worse than The Spirits Within. And spin-off after spin-off after spin-off after spin-off for the Final Fantasy franchise. The amount of games released with the Final Fantasy name attached to them created in the 7th generation of games alone is more than some successful franchises have entirely, which says a lot. Meanwhile though, Sakaguchi had actually created his own video game company called Mistwalker, which was working closely with Microsoft to make several games for their upcoming Xbox 360 console. Eventually, the game Blue Dragon released in 2006 to okay reviews. Most people didn't hate the game, but it wasn't really anything to write home about. It did, however, break sales records for the Xbox 360 in Japan, as most Japanese players preferred PlayStation or Nintendo consoles, and it really sold mostly on Sakaguchi's involvement, and also getting some other big names involved, like Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu, and famous Dragon Ball and Dragon Quest artist Akira Toriyama. A year later, Mistwalker's second game, Lost Odyssey, released, which also had Sakaguchi and Uematsu's involvement, and this one actually did pretty well. It sold well enough that Microsoft had even considered making Lost Odyssey a franchise, and reviews were generally pretty high, people's major complaint being that the game was a bit too old school in some areas, which many, however, actually saw as a plus. They released several games on the Nintendo DS like Archaic Sealed Heat, Away, Shuffle Dungeon, and 2 more Blue Dragon games, Blue Dragon Plus and Blue Dragon Awakened Shadow. However, Sakaguchi wanted to work on a bigger project more in the style of his older games, and for the first time since Final Fantasy V, he would actually take on the role of director on a Nintendo Wii game simply titled The Last Story. Meanwhile, back at Square Enix, things were rough. They had just released Final Fantasy XIII, which, although sold pretty well and received relatively good reviews at first, fans slowly started to realize how little this game actually had in common with the previous entries. It was the first main series Final Fantasy to be in a sci-fi setting, the first to not have absolutely any tracks from Uematsu, including the iconic main theme, Prelude, and Victory theme. It had a very complicated story that required reading journals to understand, and above all, it was linear beyond what most players deemed acceptable. But by the time complaints started to come out, it was already too late. Square Enix had already greenlit 2 more sequels in the Final Fantasy XIII series, which would each only sell less and less and get worse and worse reviews. Final Fantasy XIII, for many, was the breaking point, and what caused a lot of fans to quit on the series and just give up on Square Enix. And as if that wasn't enough, Final Fantasy XIV launched absolutely broken and downright unfinished in some areas. It was an MMO similar to Final Fantasy XI, except it didn't really work and everybody seemed to hate it, so they lowered and lowered the subscription fee, eventually just having to make it downright free before taking the game down and having to formally and publicly apologize for it. But at around the same time, Sakaguchi's The Last Story released in 2011 in Japan. However, RPG fans in the West wanted several of these games to get localized, and thus Operation Rainfall was born, petitioning to release specifically 3 Nintendo Wii RPGs outside of Japan. These were Xenoblade Chronicles, Pandora's Tower, and The Last Story. While reviews for this game weren't amazing, most people generally liked it, praising specifically the characters and old school RPG feel to the story, if a bit predictable at times. However, this would actually be Mistwalker's final console video game. In the following years, they released the games Party Wave and Blade Guardian on mobile phones. However, they didn't really find success until Terra Battle released in 2014. While the game was simplistic, it still ended up getting over 2 million downloads, and on top of Sakaguchi, it actually had the involvement of several well-known Square composers like the previously mentioned Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy, Kenji Ito from the Mana and Saga series, Yoko Shimomura, best known for her work in Kingdom Hearts, and Yosunori Mitsuda of Chrono Trigger fame. They really had the whole gang here. Back with Square Enix, following the backlash they had received in the recent years, they tried to make things up to the fans. They fixed Final Fantasy XIV under new director Naoki Yoshida. They also decided to dip their toes in the mobile game scene with things like Record Keeper, Brave Exvius, Mobius, Opera Omnia, and all the bravest. However, they were really banking on Final Fantasy XV, which was meant to be one of their biggest games to date and bring back all of the people that they had lost with the 13 generation. So did they succeed? Kind of. Final Fantasy XV ended up being one of the more successful FF titles in recent history, and it launched to pretty great reviews. However, most people's major complaint was that the story was spread out over multiple titles in different mediums, like an anime, an old school beat-em-up, a VR game, several canon demos, a weird prologue novella, more mobile titles than you can count, and yes, even another movie that, yes, was rated even worse than the Final Fantasy VII one. When will they learn? This wasn't helped by the fact that many updates adding major features upon fan request were added after the game's release, making players feel like they got an unfinished product at launch. And a total of 9 episodes of story DLC that filled in some pretty major holes within the story, some of which are still not out to this day, close to 2 years after the game's release. And what has Sakaguchi been doing this entire time? Well, actually working on a follow-up to his mobile title. They had Terra Battle 2 planned, which actually released and was nowhere near as popular as the original, as well as Terra Wars, which we don't really know much about as of now. He actually appeared at the uncovered Final Fantasy XV event before its launch, basically giving the game his, quote, blessing, despite the fact that this ran contrary to his own beliefs. Above all else, he believed that games should be complete and self-contained experiences, yet if any game was criticized the most by fans for being anything but a complete experience, it was Final Fantasy XV. So is Sakaguchi really doing all that great now ever since he left Square? Well, to be frank, no. All of the games that his company released on consoles received mixed to slightly positive reviews, none of them really standing out in a sea of other games. And in recent years, they've been reduced to only working on mobile titles, only one of which has actually received any kind of success. At the same time, though, Square Enix might still be a juggernaut of a company within the video game industry and have released many successful games in recent years, but they still have a long way to go before truly winning back the hearts of fans that fell in love with their games so many years ago.
It's a real shame because I think all of us know that both Sakaguchi and Square Enix could be doing a lot better if they were to just work together like they did, but a fan can only dream. Anyways, in the meantime, I'm actually going to download that Terra Battle 2 game because it actually seemed pretty interesting, and oh son of a bitch, would you look at that, they're shutting it down next month.